This is Matthew Smalden for the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. The date today is the 15th of May 2018. I shall be speaking with Mrs. Yvonne Hunt, née Lloyd, at her home in Wallingford. We shall be discussing her experiences during the Second World War, where she worked at the Ministry of Aircraft Production, that's in London, in Kingston upon Thames, and at RAF Cardington. So, to start, could I ask when and where you were born, please?
On the 25th of April, 1918, in Buenos Aires.
Thank you. So can I ask then a little about your family? Were your family from Buenos Aires, or
No. My father was a chartered accountant, and he took a job with the telephone company, as chief accountant of the telephone company, because it was large. A great deal of industry in at that time in South America was owned by British, anyway, it was British interest, and it was losing money. And so when he went, he was asked just to do a little bit of investigation, and he found out why it was losing money was that they flogged off all the copper wire.
Goodness.
But that was his principal job as a chief accountant.
And did you grow up there, or did you return home?
After the war, I think it was January 1919, we came back to England for a holiday, and he had to go back because it was only a holiday, but my mother, who had not been happy there and was not getting on with my father, declined to go back. She stayed here, so I stayed with her.
And were you an only child?
Yes.
And where did you stay in England?
Oh. We moved around from place to place. I had a completely nomadic childhood until I was 7. And when I was 7, my mother actually settled in Worthing. Or at least for a time she settled in the house there. But after a bit we moved to another house on the seafront. Originally it was a house on the outskirts of Worthing, more or less in the country. It was called South Farm Road, because actually it was a farm road. But then we moved to a house on the seafront.
And did your mother have a job at this time, or was she receiving money from your father?
She received an allowance from my father. My mother never had a job in her life. Women of her generation, she was born in 1878, didn't work. Well, I suppose poor women did, but middle-class women certainly didn't. The daughters stayed at home till they got married, or they married and they stayed at home.
And can I ask where you attended school?
In Worthing. At the convent of Notre Dame de Sion.
And at what age did you leave school?
17.
And did you go into employment at that time?
Yes. I worked in a library for a time until I married, which was actually when I was 18.
And was the person who you married, was that somebody who you had known since childhood, or was it somebody you met through
No, my mother had a very close friend who lived not far from us, and she had a son and daughter quite a lot older than I was, but the son had a lot of old school friends, and so through that I got to know these older boys and girls, and my husband was one of them.
And can I ask how much older he was?
5 years.
Right. And so you got married, that would have been 1930, you were 18, 1936, is
Yes.
that correct? And so did you then stop working in the library, or did you continue?
No, married women then didn't work.
And so could you tell me, the period around this time is obviously starting to build up towards the war. Were you aware, or did you hear of anything about
Oh
that?
yes, because they had lectures in the town hall on on gas attacks and gas masks, and they a little bit later they issued gas masks to everybody, and babies had a sort of an enclosed plastic, I suppose it was plastic or rubber, cradle, and you zip the child up in there, and it had a filter, so any gases you were supposed to, it was supposed to be quite safe.
Mm.
And small children had special little tiny gas masks. They issued those, they gave these lectures. There was various warnings about poison, gas attacks, and frightened everybody to death. Oh no, we all knew it was coming.
And do you remember hearing about the outbreak of the war?
Oh yes. Chamberlain made a speech. It was on a Sunday morning. And he concluded by saying, I have to tell you we're now at war with Germany. He hadn't finished, then suddenly the air raid siren went, because they'd been practicing with the air raid siren so we would know. They made a sort of hoo noise, and then the all clear was a hoo clear noise. And so, of course, we rushed out. I had a baby outside in the garden. I rushed up, grabbed the pram in and rushed in the house. And of course it was all just a scare.
And so you mentioned you had a baby. Was that your child?
Yes.
So you were already a mother at the outbreak of the war?
Yes.
I see. And your husband, did he join up? Was he called up?
No, he joined up because he didn't want to wait to be called up, because if you joined up you had a bit of choice as to what you did. If you were called up you were put in what was known as the PPI. You probably know what that is.
Would you mind explaining?
Poor bloody infantry.
And where did your husband serve?
He joined the RASC. As you know, they were concerned merely with supplying the army, so they drove the lorries of goods and I think some of them kept stores, you know, that sort of thing. But he was a driver.
And when did he join up?
1940.
And he was posted overseas, I assume, or was that not the case?
No, he went down to, I think it was somewhere like Margate, some very surprising place, to do his initial training, and then he came back and he was posted to Swindon because there was a base, well not a base, I suppose you could, anyway, Swindon was the centre for that time for the RASC,
Mm-hmm.
and so he was there until he went abroad, but he went to Italy.
I see.
Not France, but Italy was before France, as you no doubt know.
Yes.
Sicily they landed in actually, or they went to North Africa, and from North Africa he was there for some time, and then from there he went to Sicily and the invasion, and then on to Italy, and then he remained in Italy for the rest of the war.
I see. So just going back to you then. So your husband joined up in 1940, and so you were at home then. Can I ask how it came about that you started working at the Ministry of Aircraft Production?
My mother, who by this time had vacated her large house on the seafront, she only rented it anyway, and she announced that I must have somebody with me if my husband was going away, and moved in. My mother and I never got on. We never got on when I was a child, and I thought two mistresses in one house did not work, so I said to her, very well, if you're going to stay here, you can look after David Patrick and I will take a job. So I then registered for war work, and I was interviewed by someone in London who said, I don't think you want to do the sort of war work you're thinking of. I've got a better idea for you. And he explained to me about the Ministry of Aircraft Production and the what were called aeronautical assistants, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so I joined that. So I went to London to do my training when it was being bombed, and then, as I say, from there I was posted to this firm in Kingston that made all sorts of small parts. And what you had to do was, they had their own inspectors, but you occasionally went down and had a look at what they had passed and checked to see it was according to specification. But you also had to look at their invoices to make sure that they were buying in the right material and all the processes were being followed. You checked on all that sort of thing. And
can I just ask, sorry, just to go back, you mentioned about the training which you had. What did that involve? What sort of things were you trained on?
Oh, I missed that out a bit. We were sent down to Bristol for a bit to do some training, and we were parked in a private house in Bristol, a whole lot of us. What we were taught what was called procedure, which was what you did with all these invoices and that sort of thing, and you also learn something about very basic instruction on engineering, really basically more or less what you were looking for. We listened to lectures, and then at the end we had an examination, in which I did quite well.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, then we were posted to our various destinations. As I say, mine turned out to be this factory at Kingston-on-Thames.
I see. And you mentioned as well about the bombing in London. Can I ask whereabouts you were living at that time and whether the area that you were in was affected by that?
Wait for it. The Old Kent Road.
So you were affected by it then, I imagine, quite a lot. Could I ask, do you have any particular memories of the raids?
Well, do you know, funnily enough, I wasn't frightened, because you think it's not going to fall on you. Only once did I think that, I thought, this is it. I hope Mother won't be too upset. I don't know why I thought about that, because we weren't fond of one another, but that's what flashed through my mind. But anyway, no, I survived. But I did see, the morning after a raid, you did see rather nasty sights, because until they got out and started cleaning up, you did see bits of bodies. You'd see a leg lying in the road, you know, that sort of thing. And the people slept in the tube, which was crammed, all the pavements were crammed with people just lying down on blankets or whatever they could carry, and they slept down there because it was safe, of course, down there. But I didn't live, I just lived in this big building which had been a hostel and had been commandeered, and we were put in there. It was very basic, and the bedrooms were like cells. I mean, I've never been in a prison cell, but I reckon one would be comfortable in comparison with what we lived in. But never mind, it was the war and you put up with it.
And was there a shelter there for where you went?
There was a shelter outside, but we never ever used it. One night we didn't go to sleep at all because we spent all night dealing with incendiaries which kept dropping on the roof. They used to drop incendiary bombs to set fire to places as well as ordinary bombs. But you get up in the morning and you find the whole street had gone. My father had an office in the city, and within the city mile, of course, and it had gone. The whole street had gone. Fortunately, of course, he wasn't in it.
Mm. Mm. And so you were in London, the training which you carried out at that period, are we talking sort of like the latter half of 1940 going into 1941?
1941.
It was
Early
1941.
1941. And as I say, then from there I went to Kingston, and after a time there I was sent to RAF Cardington, which, as I said, is balloons. And they made the balloons there, and they also repaired them. And what you had to do you want to know this?
Yes, please.
They had huge hangars, and they used wind machines to blow them up. And so what you had to do was you had to crawl in. There was a flap which presumably was sealed when they were up in the air, and you had to crawl in there and go in with a wandering lead and a light. And it was very peculiar because, of course, being like this, circular, you weren't quite steady on your feet. You didn't need to lean too much one way. And you then had to test, or you actually, their inspector came with you, and he had a machine which he put on the fabric, and you then checked that it registered that wasn't porous, and that any repairs had been replaced with the proper materials. That's what you were doing basically all the time, plus keeping various records about where these balloons were going to, because of course they weren't much needed there because it was Bedfordshire and quiet. They were needed in cities, and they used to be shipped off to there.
And were you billeted on the airbase, or were you privately billeted elsewhere?
You had to find your own accommodation. We had found accommodation found for us in Bristol, but after that you just had to find your own, which wasn't very easy because you weren't very highly paid, and and you needed to be somewhere not too far away because of travelling. But I managed to find somewhere in Bedford to lodge, and that's what I did, and travelled out every day because they did run buses.
And were there many other people there with you doing the same role, or were you there just on your own?
No. There were 1, 2, 3, 4 of us, and a typist. We didn't have our own typist when we were in Kingston, but I could type. So anything I could type anything that was needed. But in Kingston there was 1, 2, 3, 4 men and me. I was the only woman.
I was going to ask whether it was unusual for an inspector to be female.
Oh yeah, they had previously not been female, but of course as manpower got very short, they had to admit females. I mean, the men, there was one young man, and I don't know what he was doing there because he was a young man, but the other men were anything from middle age to really elderly, come out of retirement. So a lot of men did come out of retirement to work during the war.
And the people, the RAF people on the base, was it RAF men, or was it the WAFs that you were dealing with when you were doing inspections?
The commanding officer in charge of workshops were men, and they had 2 or 3 civilian men who were sort of senior people who were more or less in charge, and we were more or less supervising them.
I see.
And there was yes, we did have an office there, which was a luxury. And we had, when I worked in Kingston, we all were in the same very small office.
And so did you have to do daily inspections, or was it something that was done periodically?
Oh no, you worked. You started at 8 o'clock in the morning and you worked, apart from lunch breaks, of course. And I can't be absolutely certain, but I don't think we finished till 6 in the evening. I know one winter I never saw daylight because it was dark when I went in the morning and dark when I came home at night, except at the weekend. We got Saturday afternoon and Sunday, except there was some sort of rush on, and then you couldn't complain, you worked. That was an understood thing, that if you were called in, you went.
And the area where you were, there were quite a few RAF bases, I believe, in that area. Is that correct? And were there Americans there as well in Bedfordshire and going into East Anglia?
Oh yes, they were, but they weren't anything to do with us. And they were very unpopular, very popular with the local girls and very unpopular with with everybody else.
Yes, I've heard they were popular in some places for some reason, certainly. Yeah.
Perhaps I better not tell you this because it's slightly improper. But the WAFs had to be in at night,
Mm-hmm.
and they were not only in, but they were in an enclosure with railings and a locked gate. But the Yanks used to come outside, be the other side of the rails, and let me put it like this, they communicated with the RAFs through the railings.
Right.
Very improper.
Well.
But however, you learn to look the other way.
Indeed. And you were there for a period of time then. Was it for a couple of years that you were at Gardeners?
I cannot now remember exactly when I went, but I left in the March because my daughter was born in the June.
So that would have been June 1943.
42. Yeah, 43. 43.
And so when your daughter, when you were pregnant and then your daughter was born, you left
Yes.
the role and
Went back to Worthing.
And your mother was still in Worthing, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And whereabouts? Was this still along the seafront where you lived?
No, she. That's why she came to live with me, because she gave up that house. It was it was rented, and it was a very high rent and very high rate. And in any case, what she used to do to augment her income was, as it was a 7-bedroom house, she used to take summer visitors. But of course, once they planted mines in the sea, I had miles of barbed wire all along the seafront and the beach, and mines in the beach, and you couldn't go anywhere near the seafront, and all the boarding houses along the front were boarded up. Of course, you didn't get any visitors. It was at all. So, no, she came and lived with me.
And at this time, was there anything happening in Worthing with relating to the war? I mean, we were coming sort of into 43 now, so was there build-up of soldiers before D-Day and things like that?
They had American stationed locally, French Canadians, no, they had Free French in London, but I never saw any Free French there. The French Canadians and Americans, a lot of them. One of my girlfriends had an American boyfriend, but that was the only one I ever knew.
Mm-hmm. And had there been any problems with bombing in the area?
Well, what used to happen was when they used to go to, German bombers used to bomb London, if they couldn't get to London, to drop their bombs, they were driven back by fighters. What they did was they flew back a bit, and as they couldn't land with a bomb load, it's too dangerous, they just used to drop their bombs anywhere. So, yes, you got bombs dropped. There was a house there was a shop in the town which was full of stuffed animals. That's what the man there did. And a bomb was dropped on there. And it was most interesting because there was a house here and a house there. But in the middle, there was a complete blank space. Of course, and the houses either side looked perfect. Of course, they weren't. They had been, made unsafe because they're unstable. But just looking at it, you thought they looked perfect. There was this gap in the middle. And quite near where we lived, there was one dropped on somebody's, a private house. And there was, just like that, nothing left. But we used to hear them go over, of course, all the time. They went over night after night. You just got used to it. Just what you used to do was you worship with what was called a Morrison shelter. And actually, it was a steel table, or a table with a steel top, and sort of wire shelves, and it wasn't wire, it was very thick, reinforced, and you fitted these in. So I used to put the baby under there, and the theory was that if the house was bombed, the rubble would fall down on the table and you'd be all right. It was never put to the test where I was concerned, but I'm thankful to say.
And by this time you had your daughter, and you had two sons as well, is that correct?
Yes.
And they were all living with you and your mother in the house?
Yes.
I see.
My grandmother, who lived in Birmingham, was killed by a bomb, but I don't expect you want to hear about that.
Well, if you don't mind sharing the story.
Well, it's a rather horrible one, really, because what happened was there were bombs, and the windows flew in, and a sliver of glass flew across the room and severed my mother's jugular vein, and she bled to death. And my grandfather, who tried to help her, when they were found, she was quite dead, and he was covered in her blood, which is really rather horrible. And he was taken off to hospital, quite uninjured, but suffering from severe shock.
It's terrible.
She's actually in the War Records book. Her name is in there.
Could I ask what her name was?
It was Catherine Lloyd.
Thank you. That must have been terrible to hear when you were told that.
It was because they took time to find people's. If the families didn't live in Birmingham, my father was in London. They took time to find them, and what was really extra horrible was that, of course, they only were concerned with rescuing people. They weren't concerned with making the property safe until much later. So, of course, the looters went in and looted the house, and my grandparents had Georgian silver. There's one surviving piece, which is a tablespoon, which I have, and that only survived because it happened to be in a bedside table. Everything else was swiped, except for the things on there, that cup and various things. But they must have been somewhere where they couldn't find them.
And whereabouts in Birmingham did they live?
I cannot now remember, because I didn't go and visit them, because my mother had quarrelled with them, and there was a sort of family feud. So I don't exactly remember.
And going back to your time in Worthing, you mentioned that later on in the war there were prisoners, or there were Russians who were in the area.
Well, yes. The Germans took Russian Asiatic soldiers prisoners, and they were very crafty, because they didn't station them in Germany, didn't keep them as prisoners of war. They kept them as prisoners of war in France and Belgium. So, of course, when our armies liberated those, they were left with these people and didn't know what to do with them. And so they couldn't leave them loose on the country there, because they'd simply go around raping and killing. And so what they did was they brought a whole lot of them back to Worthing, and they put them in the empty hotels on the seafront. I don't know how they ate or lived. I suppose some provisions were made for it, but they were all, about 5 feet tall, very thick set, very Asiatic, and they stalked you, making noises after you. And later, years later, I met a lady from Vienna, and she said exactly the same thing happened there, that these Asiatic troops were a pain. But, and they used to try and persuade the local ironmonger to sell them methylated spirit. But what did methylated spirit for? And apparently they drank it.
Goodness.
But they were all right in England, I suppose because they dare not do anything else. But I understand that when the Russians unleashed them on Germany, that they raped and killed without being punished. They were really quite wild men, but very small, but obviously very strong.
And how long were they there for? This was after the end of the war, I assume, or
no, it wasn't.
Oh, was it not?
It was when we were in France and Belgium that's where they'd been stationing these people. They had more sense than to station them to imprison them in Germany in case they got out and caused havoc. So they thought it doesn't matter if they get out and cause havoc in an occupied country. So.
How long were they there for? Did they disappear at the end of the war and were sent back?
They kept them there. For some weeks, but there was so much objections from all the local old girls. I think they were pretty safe, but eventually they did shift them somewhere else because, of course, they couldn't return them because we hadn't met up with the Russian army. They weren't sufficiently far. We weren't sufficiently far into Germany to join up with them. So I think that's what they did. I got an idea they put them in some disused prison in the end. Well, they weren't exactly prisoners, but at least you could control them a bit.
Yes, might have been. And were they free to roam around the town?
Oh then? Yes, they followed you about in the town. I took a bus back to where I home, which wasn't actually right in the centre, but was on the outskirts in West Worthing. And the two of them got on the bus behind me, and I went upstairs, and they went upstairs, and they sat behind me, and I was sitting there, sort of on the edge of my seat all the time. And when I got off, I thought, please don't let them get off with me, but they did, and they followed me all the way home. But in the end, I looked at them and I thought, my legs are longer than yours, so I ran all the way home. And I can assure you, Roger Bannister did not run the first 4-minute mile. I did.
And did they have uniforms, these men?
They were dressed in khaki, but they weren't British Army uniforms as far as I can remember, unless they were without any insignia. But I never wanted to get really close enough to them to examine exactly what they were wearing, but they were in khaki. And they obviously had money, because, as I say, they tried to buy things. So whether they were issued with money, I don't know.
Very unusual. I've not heard anything about that before, so it's very interesting. So thank you for telling me. And your husband at this time was in Italy.
Yes.
Did you hear from him very often? Did he write?
He wrote, yes. He was in Italy until must have been Christmas 45.
So when he returned, was that the first time that he'd seen his daughter?
No. He had seen her before he went, when she was just new. But my son said, "Who's that man, Mother?" I said, "That's your father." He said, "Well, I don't like him. Tell him to go away." It's very difficult, really.
I assume he hasn't really seen him for over 5 years.
Didn't remember him at all.
Really? It must have been very difficult.
Oh, it was. A lot of people, split up. Actually, my husband and I did eventually, but you grew so much apart that you really had nothing in common. And I suppose I'd been a young girl or young woman, and then I was sort of, a woman in her late 20s and my own person. I didn't want to go back to being somebody's little girl or having my life arranged for me and all the rest of it. I'd been coping on my own with the children, all the difficulties of war, all the queuing, all the rationing, all the shortages, all the blackouts, all the difficulties, and I didn't need anybody. Lots of people that happened to. I know it sounds shocking, but that was just the plain fact.
You've been independent to a degree.
Yes, completely.
And having to make your own decisions.
You had to be. Because it was very difficult with the rationing. I mean, fish, for instance, wasn't on the ration. Wasn't rationed. Well, the only reason it wasn't rationed is because the government couldn't guarantee supply of it. I mean, it might have been better up in the north, where perhaps the water wasn't quite so heavily mined, but of course there's no fishing off the south coast at all. So fish was a rarity, and when you heard that the fishmonger actually had some fish, a queue of 100 would form in minutes. And you stood perhaps for hours before he condescended to open his shop, and you never knew whether in the end you would get one herring or something. It was a very boring life.
And was there ever any activity out at sea? Were there ever any? Do you ever see any ships, naval ships, and any action or anything like that?
No, because you couldn't have told, because you couldn't get onto the promenade. You see, the promenade was built up above the level of the pavement, and then there was the beach. And as you couldn't get up there, it was all so heavily wired or barbed wire, you couldn't get anywhere near. So you wouldn't have known, apart from hearing the roar of the sea, that you actually were at the seaside. And perhaps if we still lived in our own house and I had been in my bedroom on the second floor, I could have looked out and seen it. But of course by then I wasn't living there. I was living in a street in nowhere near the sea or road.
And then, I mean, you mentioned about briefly. We mentioned about the American and French Canadian troops who were posted in the area. Was there a noticeable build-up then before D-Day? Did you see a lot of troops in the streets, and was it noticeable when D-Day had happened and they'd left?
What actually happened was that it was full of Americans, it was full of French Canadians, and gradually people began to disappear. You'd see a whole convoy moving off. And what they were doing, of course, they were all moving down for the D-Day invasion. So we knew it must be coming because they were clearing the place entirely of troops. I mean, you hardly ever saw a uniform by then. Mm-hmm. They'd sort of scrape the bottom of the barrel to get everybody.
Mm. And moving on towards the end of the war, do you remember hearing that Germany had surrendered? Were there any celebrations?
Yes. I think there was a street party, not where I lived, but on the whole, people thought, we still got Japan to beat yet. And they were relieved, yes, and there was some sort of excitement, but for us everything went on the same. There was still all the blackout, the blackout was subsequently lifted, I must say, but there was still all the rationing and everything, so, and no troops, of course. They were all still in Germany because they didn't bring the army home from Germany, they kept it there because, as you know, they divided it up into sectors, and so they were there sort of peacekeeping or guarding, and they used Germans to ex-German soldiers to do all the clearing of the rubble. My brother-in-law said he was told to take out a gang of Germans every day for bomb clearance, and he signed for 12 bodies. 12 bodies, not 12 men. He said, and provided he took 12 bodies back, nobody inquired why some of them weren't alive.
And
he said the SS were very arrogant, and so you just gave them a bang on the back of the head with your rifle butt. I mean, our soldiers didn't behave as badly as Germans, but I can't say that they behaved all that well either, from what I've heard and what I've been told.
And you mentioned about the mines and things on the beaches at Worthing. They were presumably cleared after the war, but were they cleared by British soldiers or were they done by Germans? I've heard the Germans did them some places.
No, we had bombers, but it was years after. You couldn't go on the beach for long after. I know my children went downstairs. By that time my mother had moved into a flat. Went down to stay with her, and by then you could go back on the beach. But it was a long, long time, because there wasn't really any priority about getting the beach ready for children to go on. There was much more important things one needed doing.
Well, I've only got one last question for you, and that is, do you think that your experiences during the war changed you?
Yes, because, as I say, they made me completely independent. I had to be. And I wanted to make my own decisions. I didn't want anybody telling me what to do or how to advise me. And so I think it made me very much older. And also a good deal more broad-minded, because I saw how people I knew behaved in a way which, when I was a young girl, would have horrified me. And I accepted that there was a different moral code. Life would never be the same again. What's more's the pity was life was much more pleasant before, and much easier.
In what way, can I ask?
You got 3 posts a day, first early morning, midday and afternoon, and the last collection was 6 o'clock, but if you went to the general post office it was 9 o'clock. The milkman delivered early in the morning and came back again in the middle of the morning to bring you cream or eggs or whatever you wanted. The baker came every day, the butcher called for orders every day and brought back your meat. The fishmonger did the same. Housewives had a very easy life.
And that all stopped. Yeah.
People used to go and meet for coffee and meet their friends in the morning. I dare say young women now with children probably still do the same thing. But during the war, of course, you didn't, and for long after. It was a much less leisured existence. And, of course, servants were not then a forgotten race. My mother had maids, and I had a cleaner. She did the housework, she didn't do anything for the children. But, I mean, it was a much more comfortable life, I must admit.
And your sons they were born just before the war, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And they stayed in Worthing throughout the war? They weren't evacuated or moved away?
No, they, for a time, they did evacuate children, but they were being taken to Wales, and I thought it's too far. I couldn't really visit them, and no, I want them under my eye. And if we're going to be bombed, we'll all be bombed together. So no, they didn't go, but they quite enjoyed the war, because when they saw planes up in the sky fighting, they went out and watched, and then they were doing this, being planes themselves. They had toy rifles, they were killing Germans. You'd think they'd have grown up militaristic, but they didn't. They're very pacific, so, or placid. No, they were quite happy. They weren't frightened at all, and they just accepted that when the sirens went, you just had to go and get under the kitchen table, or you had to go and hide somewhere. Children are very I suppose you could call it elastic.
Adapting to the situation quite easily. Mm. And I forgot to ask, we mentioned about bombing. Were there ever any doodlebugs over
Oh,
Worthing?
yes. I thought my last hour had come once, because this doodlebug came and it went straight over my head, and I knew I was going to drop in front of me and this is the end. But no, it went on a little bit farther before it went off, which was lucky for me but unfortunate for somebody else. But the other later ones were worse than that, because you didn't get the warning, and I think they caused far more devastation until I think the RAF managed to bomb the site.
Were there quite a few doodlebugs that landed then in the Worthing area, and the rockets as well?
Yes. But mostly, the doodlebugs were mostly in London. But if I went up to, I had an uncle, an aunt, who lived in London. They stayed all through the war. They lived in Kensington. If I went up to visit them at all, it was quite common. Oh, there goes one. I think you weren't frightened anymore. As I said, you didn't really believe it was going to hit you. It was always going to hit somebody else. But the rockets were worse, because they caused more damage, actually.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been very nice speaking with you. We'll leave it there if that's okay. So, thank you very much.
Well, I don't think I've been very much help to you.
Well, you have, so I hope you don't mind me disagreeing, but it's been very interesting from my perspective, so thank you.